to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dan Sutter with the Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University. States across the country operate pension programs for their employees, and many of these state pension programs have been underfunded in recent years. In other words, they have liabilities that might exceed their assets, putting them in a condition where they might conceivably run out of money one day. Well, the Johnson Center at Troy University here has recently conducted a new study to examine Alabama state public employees pension system, the retirement system of Alabama. And some new math that we have in this study suggests that the problem of underfunding of state pensions might even be worse than sometimes have been reported. To discuss this study with us here this evening is the director of the Johnson Center, Dr. Scott Beaulier. Scott, welcome back to the show.
Hey Dan, great to be on.
Now, before we get started talking about some of the details of this new study, which I think we'll want to talk about in quite a bit of detail, explain to our viewers a little bit about how the retirement system of Alabama works and what's the role of a public pension program.
Sure. So the RSA covers about 335,000 employees in the state of Alabama. Mm-hmm. It has three different programs underneath it: the employee system of Alabama, the teacher system, and then a system for judges as well. So there are three portfolios underneath the umbrella of the retirement systems of Alabama. As a public employee, and if you're eligible, it can be anything from hospital workers to university professors to teachers to judges and many other professions that are public sector professions. As an employee, you individually make contributions about 7.5% of your salary per month, and then your employer is also making a contribution that you probably never see or pay attention to. That's in the 10 to 12% area in any given year. So total contributions per pay period go into the retirement systems of Alabama, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20%. And these funds are then invested into stocks, bonds, a diverse class of assets with the hope of getting return. And some of these funds also, of course, are paid out to people upon retirement. They're not tied to you, the funds going in. The funds go in, and many of them are being paid out to someone who's retirement age now. And it's a defined benefit program that guarantees you through the remainder of your life a certain amount of income based on your salary, years of service, and it's a formula that we can talk more about.
So this, in one sense, is similar in some ways to the kind of 401k that an employee might have. In other words, as a way of saving for retirement.
That's right. And it's
and you also rely on some returns on investment, so you don't have to save every dollar that you're going to end up spending
exactly
in retirement.
That's right. So the hope of the program is that it provides like a guarantee level of safety and income in the retirement years, and many of these programs can be very generous. So if you're an employee who puts in 25 years at Troy University, you make $100,000. The formula is that you accumulate benefits of about 2% per year. So you retire at the age of 60, you've worked 25 years, you would take home a check each year in retirement of $50,000. The nice thing for the employee, never have to worry about any investment decisions. You don't have to know anything about the stock market. The promise is that someone else is doing it for you.
Now, Alabama is not the only state to have a program like this, so these are very common countrywide, right?
That's right. Almost every state has, in fact, every state does have a public sector pension fund of some kind. Now, some of them are managed in 401k style defined contribution. Most are defined benefit programs. And if you were to look at the defined benefit landscape across America in just at the state level, not looking at Social Security or any federal defined benefit programs. Right now, they're underfunded by about $1.5 trillion nationally. Officially, that's the official number. The estimates that many in the financial, the field of finance estimate the true liabilities are in the neighborhood of $4.5 to $5 trillion instead.
So what does this mean when we talk about, in the open I mentioned this, and you brought up this idea that these pension programs are underfunded?
So what it means is that if you were to just total up all of the promises that you have made to current retirees and future retirees, those of us who are in the system, not vested yet, but have some amount of benefits that we've accumulated, some of us who are vested, if you added up all of the liabilities that are owed and offset them with all of the assets that are currently in investments, that are currently coming in as a stream of payments, if you look at the total assets minus liabilities, it turns out to be this large unfunded liability. You don't have the assets there to cover it. So here in the state, we have about a $15 billion liability officially. The RSA acknowledges that they're underfunded at the moment. What Norcross's study does in our book that you and I are co-authoring, Improving Lives in Alabama, what her study does is says that this is actually a bad estimate of our true liability. It's actually a factor of 4 bigger. It's about a $60 billion liability instead.
So, as we get into this idea, if a pension program is underfunded, does that mean that it's going to be unable to pay benefits to the retirees, like in the near future, or at some point in the future, or when is the problem going to come to roost?
The issue of underfunded pensions is something we're beginning to see the consequences from in other states like New Jersey and Illinois. What it usually means for pensioners, and those who are RSA members watching this can breathe a sigh of relief, is not much. They generally don't experience a cut in benefits because they're protected by state law from cuts in their benefits. So the pensioners usually are the last people to get hit with poor pension performance and poor pension management. It's usually everyone else. How does everyone else get hit? Through higher taxes and through basically cuts in services, essential services, to help shore up funding for the pension program. So Detroit's like a nice case to look at. It's a city pension problem that's basically brought the city to its knees. And the pensioners in bankruptcy, Detroit went into bankruptcy, and the pensioners in bankruptcy emerged almost completely unscathed. But everyone else took a cut, thanks to the fact that pensions are basically protected. Even in bankruptcy, they enjoy pretty significant protections.
And in some private companies, I mean, most companies have some type of a pension program for their employees, and some of them have the same kind of defined benefit program as well. And I think General Motors have some problems with their defined benefit program.
They did, and many Fortune 500 companies, in fact most, have shifted out of defined benefit programs to defined contribution because it's very difficult as a company to manage things like expanding life expectancy, changing demographics, changing preferences of your employees, and all of these things basically turned the pension arithmetic upside down. So the only way that defined benefits can sustain themselves, just like Social Security in the long run, is if you keep growing the base, or you enjoy ridiculous rates of return. If you assume normal rates of return, a normal base of people providing payments to the defined benefit, they eventually become something that exhausts the benefit in terms of payments out.
Now, you mentioned already this idea of the alternative of a defined benefit program would be a defined contributions program. So if you could explain that a little bit.
Sure. So a defined benefit is this guaranteed payment based on years of service and based on your salary. So if you make $10,000 and you work 25 years, you might get $5,000 per year back. If you make $100,000, you might get $50,000 back. Defined contribution instead pays you individually a certain amount of money per month or per year based on your salary, but it goes right into an individualized account that you control. So one that's very popular in education is TIAA-CREF, but it could be Vanguard or Fidelity, a host of other pension programs. You individually make the investment decisions. You bear the risk instead of the taxpayer bearing the risk. You reap the rewards as well. But the really appealing thing about it from the standpoint of state finances is that the public sector pension problem of underfunding no longer is there. It goes away because you're guaranteed your payment each month. As long as they're making that payment, it's fully funded by definition. They're making their payments. There's no liability that's just looming based on how long people live, based on bad investment decisions by managers. It's all there, and then it's just a question of whether you've saved enough and made good investment decisions individually.
From the individual employee standpoint, then, what would be the difference if you were in a defined benefit versus defined contribution plan? I think you've already hinted at this, the idea of the risk, or who bears the risk in this case.
So individuals bear the risk. They would probably, under many state plans, either have managers or consultants who recommend a diverse portfolio to them, or have a default that's a diversified portfolio that's maybe a life cycle fund with low costs. There are ways to deal with the issue of individuals picking stocks, and there are products in the market that basically say, we'll handle that and you don't need to worry about it, even at the individual level. So the issue of the individual being the bearer of the risk has to do with just taxpayers not being on the hook for this rising liability where it's eating up 25, 30% of state budgets in many states. Just pension obligations are eating up that much of the budget, and that's a tough burden for taxpayers.
Now, in some states, I mean, politicians have taken some actions that have burdened the pension programs even more. So it's not just a matter of expanding life expectancies, right? So sometimes some states aren't paying as much into their pensions as they're supposed to be, or they keep adding extra benefits on. So what are some of the problems with that?
So there are a lot of problems. If you think of your pension liability as being like your mortgage payment, there's a minimal amount you need to be paying in each year to prevent basically the juice from running and interest just overwhelming you in the long run. Pensions work the same way. If you're not meeting your minimal obligation, bad things are going to happen in the long run. And Pennsylvania is a state that hasn't even been hitting its minimal required contribution for several years now. Lawmakers basically have said, in the short run, we think it's more important to fund our fire department or our police force. That's great, probably keeps them in office. Long run, they have this mounting pension problem that's huge, just huge in the state of Pennsylvania. So when you don't address your issue of liabilities and you don't somehow cover those, either through cutting benefits, which is, as we've talked about, kind of impossible, increasing contributions, or just capping your liability in the long run through some reforms like shifting to defined contribution. If you don't do those things, the problem just balloons and it becomes this really big problem that states like New Jersey and Illinois are having a heck of a time managing.
So it's not necessarily the employees who are at fault for some of these problems that are emerging.
No, it's the model. In fact, it's not even the people up in Montgomery making investment decisions. They're such small players in this problem. The real problem is that the defined benefit model was a model for the first half of the 20th century. And what's happened is in the second half of the 20th century, we've enjoyed tremendous progress as a society. We live longer. We expect to retire earlier because of just thanks to economic growth and higher levels of prosperity. And our pension system hasn't kept up with these changes at all. The notion that you or I, or a lot of people like us, can retire at the age of 55 or 60 and look forward to living to 85 or 90 is something that isn't being reflected in our pension system. No fault of the employees. It's not that they're just sucking money from the system. No fault of the people who aren't getting the crazy high returns up in Montgomery directing the RSA. It's not anyone's fault other than it being a bad model.
Well, now, the Johnson Center, we're coming out with this series of studies this year called Improving Lives in Alabama. And our most recently released chapter of this book deals with this exact problem, and it suggests that the problem could be worse. So tell us a little bit about our new study.
Sure. So Eileen Norcross authored the study. She's a pension expert who's working at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She's dealt with Illinois, she's dealt with New Jersey, she's dealt with Rhode Island pension problems, and all three of those states are worse than Alabama. Alabama's probably about 15th worst, though, in the country in terms of how the RSA is doing. If you look at its funding ratio, its assets on the books are only about 60% of its liabilities. And that's the official numbers, not Norcross's numbers. Norcross would put it in the 20s instead. So we have serious problems, and what she's trying to just call on lawmakers to do is take these accounting realities seriously and look at the issue and see if there's room for reform. And one of her big things, the title of the chapter is A Case for Economic Accounting. Another way to interpret that title is a case for realistic accounting, something that's more consistent with what the private sector is doing in the way of accounting.
So let's get into this a little bit more, because I'm sure the pension accounting and pension numbers give me a headache.
Me too.
And I'm sure that many of our viewers would feel the same way. But there is an important issue that's involved here that Ms. Norcross is getting at in this study, and how it is that RSA is calculating the value of their assets, right? And it relates to the discount rate or the expected rate of return on their investments.
So it's very complex, and we don't want to bore our viewers with too much detail, but basically only the public sector in America is allowed to account for their liabilities with the rate of return being used as their discount rate. What this does is it greatly understates their true liability. If they were in the private sector, the SEC would be charging them with fraud. And in fact, just last week, the SEC came out with some language saying that if public sector pension funds were operating in the private sector, they'd be regulated and this would not be allowed to go on. They were commenting on the public sector pension problem. That's the SEC saying this is really a house of cards, basically. Moody's, the credit agency Moody's, has said that the way public sector accounting takes place is just unacceptable, and they're now looking into true liabilities, much like Ms. Norcross did. So the issue is a very real one. It's something that finance experts have addressed. Other countries, by the way, account for their liabilities properly. The UK, Canada, many other places don't use US accounting standards, and they have much more realistic liabilities that they report as opposed to us. So it's a serious problem, but it's one that the public pension administrators in the US just really don't want to embrace. And it's mysterious why they don't, because it in fact would be an opportunity to say, maybe you need more resources. Maybe we can help you. Instead, it's just, in most cases, just as it's been in reaction to this study, we don't have a problem. It's denialism of a problem, when in fact, admission of the problem could be something really helpful for the program administrators.
Now, in Alabama, the RSA is making their calculations based on that they expect an 8% return on their investment or their assets as they invest it. And Ms. Norcross points out that that's probably too generous, too overly optimistic, and exceeds what they've been realizing over the last decade. Right?
So her point, there's a twofold point. One, when you're discounting a liability, and this is a liability that's a guaranteed payment, we're going to get our payments, those of us who are in the system. It sounds more like a bond. It's guaranteed. It's a guaranteed stream of payments that you can just count on happening. So the discount rate on that asset should be something more like 2 to 3%, which is the discount rate that she uses in the study. So when you're properly accounting for it, you bring that rate down. Now on the return side, they've been assuming 8%. Over the last 10 years, the S&P has been getting 9%. So 8% seems reasonable over the 10-year period, but the RSA hasn't been keeping up with their own expected return or market return. They've only been getting 7%. So each year that you miss on that return, that gap just increases that much more. You're not hitting long-run expected returns, which means you go after what's been happening with the RSA. If you look at their asset selection, they've been taking on more risk in pursuit of higher returns to make up for the fact that they've been lagging in recent years, and that's really concerning. If you're just going after more risk because of poor performance in the past, that could just blow up.
This actually sounds very reminiscent of what happened in the savings and loan crisis in the early 1980s, when the savings and loans invested in a lot of risky assets to try to make up for the losses they had incurred.
Right.
So this entire sort of like almost house of cards, it seems to end up, in some sense, benefiting current politicians to some extent. They can provide very high levels of benefits to state employees and don't really have to pay the full amount that they really should be paying.
That's right. The full amount will be something that is addressed down the road. And in all likelihood, anyone in the system right now isn't going to feel it all that much more. What'll probably happen if there's not more reform taken is that employee required contributions will go up. They'll go up from 7.5% to maybe 10%. Employer contributions, which we never see, will go up significantly. So the employer to fund retirements will suddenly be going from 10 to 12% to 15, maybe 20%. That total contribution then is getting up in the neighborhood of 30% of a person's salary. Okay, so if you're making $100,000, it's actually $130,000 in compensation that you could be receiving. Right. And most of that is just going to this bucket that is being paid out to other people primarily. If we don't take action, we become a pay-as-you-go system eventually. And that's the real concern, is it starts to become like Social Security, where the amount you're getting out is even less than what you put in. And the whole point of the system is to assure return for you and stability in retirement, but you end up with less dollars than you put in.
And so, I mean, to some extent, there is an intergenerational equity. Well, that's a fancy term, but the fact that to some extent, by current people who have retired not having paid their share into the retirement system. Current employees had to just, they had a hike in their contributions they had to make a few years ago, and that was in effect to sort of make up for some of these contributions that weren't made earlier, right?
Exactly, that's right. And future retirees can look forward to having to work longer for the same guaranteed payments that people were enjoying, to having to contribute more money. And who knows what will happen. Another thing that's happened a lot in recent years is cost of living increases have basically stopped. Because our pension program is so poorly underfunded, lawmakers aren't passing cost of living adjustments onto current retirees. Now you might say, well, that at least is helping keep the system at 60% funding instead of 35 or 40%. Well, cost of living adjustments are maybe something that'll never happen to the future generation of retirees too. So you had generation upon generation getting nice cost of living adjustments in retirement years, and now this has just gone away. Because that's something that's at the discretion of lawmakers. It's not indexed, it's not tied to CPI or anything like that. They can just make decisions about whether to do it or not.
You mentioned how it is that between the 7.5% that employees have to contribute now and like the 12% that some institutions have to contribute. I mean, that's about 20%.
That's right.
And just to put that in perspective, in many ways that is pretty much the equivalent of a tax.
Yeah.
Right, and that's a really high tax rate.
It sure is. And you know, if you know anything about finance, or if you've read even some of the most basic books, 10%, if you save 10% of your salary for a long period of time, you're going to be just fine. But we've turned over 20%, maybe it'll go to 30% in our lifetimes, to pension experts to fund a guaranteed stream of payments to other people, and it's still not enough money to assure you a sufficient retirement. You still better be, the main message of the Norcross study and the main message of the work that we're trying to communicate in this chapter is that you better be saving on your own, because this whole notion of a guarantee for you is not really guaranteed, especially if you're a young employee in the state system.
And because a 20% that we're paying for the pension, I mean, the state income tax is 5%.
Yeah.
And economists often write about how it is that income tax rates can deter economic activity in a state. And I mean, 5% is small potatoes compared to this 20% that, you know, in effect, state employees or have to end up paying, and whether they don't, they may not pay it all themselves, they may not be realizing the fact, but there's a 20% wedge there between what it costs the state to hire somebody and what somebody gets in the way of take-home pay.
That's right, and it's one of these real unseen things when you think about where that tax is coming from. So tuition will rise for students because a lot of people are RSA members in universities. So what do you do to cover all of these costs? You raise tuition, and we're seeing this around the state right now. Fees and all kinds of other things will go up to use the court system. And these are taxes in addition to that small potato 5% tax that you mentioned.
Now, there are some other inefficiencies that result from a defined benefit program like we have here in Alabama, and particularly the way RSAs operate. I know you've written at length previously on this, so if you wanted just to share a couple of these with us.
Sure. So one that Norcross mentions is that the RSA is really focused on in-state investments, investing about 10% of all assets in state projects, so that you get these economic development efforts and opportunities like the Airbus plant or the Robert Trent Jones Golf Course that are job creators and hubs for tourism. She calls these, in her words, pet projects. You know, you're basically trying to direct state resources towards what you think are really high value opportunities. Well, this is something that any one person isn't going to be very good at. It suffers from what we call a planning or a knowledge problem, but it also breeds cronyism, because what you're doing is basically trying to fund and inject large amounts of state capital into projects that weren't really there in the absence of state subsidization anyway. So she says that these aren't very high returning, and they're masking and basically taking away from, they're adding to our liability more or less. That's one issue. Another big inefficiency of just the system in general is what it does to the labor market in the state. You have endless people who are basically counting down their time to be invested. You have others who make it over the hump and become vested, and immediately, as soon as they do so, they leave. They say, I have to get out of the state of Alabama, because or they just change to the private sector, because the incentives change for you so that you're no longer wanting to be a public sector employee. Because once you become vested, you're eligible for 50% benefits, And why would you stay on your job at that point and just continue to accrue benefits that you can't realize? So you see this all the time. If you're in a supervisory role, like I am in the university, people just saying, I've made it to my goalpost and now I'm gone. And that's really just not something that we would call sound, prudent labor market policy.
So explain that a little bit more, because
Sure.
in our business we see some of the evidence of this as we have colleagues who retire or move once they hit retirement age from one university to another university, and they're actually retiring on
That's right.
while still working.
That's right. So let's consider someone who gets their PhD in economics. They're 26 years old when they finish. Under old RSA rules, they would have only had to put in 25 years and they'd be eligible for a full retirement. So you put in 25 years, you retire making $100,000, just to be conservative. You're 51 years old, you're drawing a check for $50,000 from the RSA. If you continue to work, you miss out on that $50,000 check. You can take home, your $100,000 still, but you're missing out on the $50,000 of benefits for doing nothing. So why not just quit at that point, pocket the $50,000, and then the only condition is you have to head out of the state for another university job someplace. And we, like you said, we see this all the time in academia. So productive people in their early 50s or mid 50s into their 60s sometimes leave, and they could still be adding a lot of value to your university's reputation. Right. They head for other jobs simply because of the dynamics of this goofy defined benefit system. Because
you're not actually adding to the amount of money that you or maybe your surviving spouse or others would have by.
So you take your $50,000 a year check plus whatever the other university's paying you. So you're doing much better than you would be if you stayed.
And that's an inefficiency that simply wouldn't be there under a defined contributions plan, right?
That's right. So a defined contribution plan, instead, you're 51 years old, you have $100,000 that you're making per year, and the employer might be paying you 10% on top of that to your own individual account. So then your calculation about when should I retire, where should I be working, is based solely on how much you're making in that job, how much your employer's adding to your account, and what your own individual return has been and your accumulation of wealth. That makes a lot more sense than making these calculations about guaranteed payments and what that's doing for your nest egg.
Because you really want to be retired for more years under a defined benefit program. You're getting more of a return as opposed to simply building up a.
It makes no sense. It makes no sense to work any longer than you absolutely have to under a defined benefit plan. Yeah.
Well, do you think there's going to be any chance to see some changes for the good?
We hope so. I think that one of the great things about this Norcross chapter is it's kind of a wake-up call to lawmakers, to the RSA, to public employees everywhere in the state about what our true liability is. And it should at least spark a conversation about what might actually be waiting for us in terms of a liability. And if it is as big as Norcross thinks it is, we really need to do some soul searching about which way forward. And she offers some solutions in her book, shifting to a defined contribution for all new employees. There are a lot of different models out there, but the first step is just a willingness to acknowledge a problem. And we're not quite there yet.
Well, thanks very much. I think we've helped raise the awareness of this problem here this evening.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.